Welcome back to the Lights Out podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls around the world. Good evening, boys and girls. Are you ready for bed? Are you all snuggled up and ready for the Lights Out bedtime story? Good, because you're in for a treat tonight. That's right, with a book called Wake Up! It's Going to Be a Busy Day by Cleminson. Wake up and up and up and stretch and scratch and scrub and wash, comb your hair, give your teeth a brush. It's time to dress. Dress up and up and up. Find pants and vests and shoes and socks and shorts and coats and favorite tops. It's time for school. Listen up and up and up and read and draw and count and spell. Ask and answer, show and tell. It's time to play. Swing up and up and up and run and jump and climb and slide. Sing and dance, seek and hide. It's time for dinner now. Eat up and up and up and chew and sip and slurp and crunch. Use knife and fork and chomp and munch. It's time to wash, clean up and up and up. Then pick and choose and scratch and look and read aloud a perfect book. At last, it's time to cuddle up and up and up. Say goodnight, yawn and stretch, shut your eyes, doze and rest. It's time to dream. The end of a beautiful book called Wake Up! It's Going to Be a Busy Day by Cleminson. Here on the Lights Out podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls who have busy days around the world. Good night, 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 good night.